baphuma esiqiwini kade bekuvalele hlanga lomhlabathi bayede.
Welcome back. Well, you saw part of this earlier today, the presidency holding what they called a technical briefing on Operation Vulindlela. It's to outline structural reforms proposed by government. The Operation Vulindlela was formed last year, involved senior members of government, the National Treasury and the presidency. They say they'll ensure the implementation of structural reforms by government. They've been long promised. They're mainly in the electricity, digital communication and related sectors. And Bernstein is at the Centre for Development Enterprise. And good afternoon to you. We've had big plans to grow the economy before. Are you expecting, from what we know about this one, are you expecting it to make a difference?
Look, I think this is really important and one of the few hopeful things we should be watching carefully. What we're getting is the beginnings of a team in the presidency and the Treasury that are dedicated to making reforms actually happen. So as we know, we've had many promises of reform since this president took over, but very little delivery. And what Operation Vulindlela is trying to do is to work with ministers, identify the problems and try and get things done. Now, will the president back Operation Vulindlela when they're up against a senior minister? That remains to be seen. But I think this is a positive development and does indicate some hope. There's serious people involved in trying to get some important work done.
I mean, some of the problems that they want to address, and I mean, they say this explicitly, are around electricity. There are issues around Eskom, but there are also issues around regulation and the possibility of more independent power producers coming into the system. There's also, I mean, communications and the release of spectrum. That's also very complicated. Do you think that this will be able to cut through that red tape, even vested interests, if there are any?
Look, I think any reforming president needs a team around him, a small team of absolutely top-class technical and political and bureaucratic experts who can work with vested interests in the bureaucracy to move reform along. So this is within that tradition, and I would have liked to have seen it earlier, but I'm delighted to see it being established now. How much success they will have remains to be seen, but we have serious people trying to push this along. Now, you and I could say, Stephen, that maybe some ministers should be fired, and I have certainly said that publicly, and we need much more accountability from the executive to the country for when things don't happen. But a lot of these reforms are complex. Take corporatizing the ports and trying to bring the private sector in an appropriate way. I'm absolutely in favor of that, and that's been on the books for 15 years. So now we have a team of dedicated people trying to push this along and get results. So it should be seen positively. It shows real commitment from the president. I hope he will follow it through when there's recalcitrance. We're waiting on electricity reforms. They're taking much, much, much too long. And this is obviously a selective list of reforms. We could debate which ones and why. And are these the most important to get growth going? But this is movement. And in a country desperate for some leadership and movement on reform, I think this is a positive signal.
In a way, it seems to me what this is trying to do is to make sure that government does not play a role in throttling or stopping business, but trying to help business. And it's got to do that in certain ways. Electricity provision is one, spectrum is another, dealing with water, the ports you've already mentioned. Is that the right way to see this? I mean, I know some economists just want government to sort of get out of the way, to do what government is supposed to do in a proper way, and that will allow business to operate. Do you see it in that tradition?
Look, Stephen, I think societies like ours need an effective and smart state. Unfortunately, we don't have one. And that's why I'm positive about Operation Vulindlela. We need to push and identify where there is a lack of capacity and do something about it. So societies like ours need an effective state. But I am absolutely convinced that in South Africa today, we have to free up the private sector. We have to bring in markets and companies and entrepreneurs to help us get the economy moving again. And what we don't need is the kind of state-driven approach which I fear permeates a lot of the recovery plan that government is implementing. So we have to free up the private sector and markets. We have to get a move on. We need a sense of real urgency as to the very dire straits the country is in on almost every front, from the economy to the fiscal crisis to unemployment, not to mention the social consequences of the lockdown that we're experiencing. But we have to free up the private sector. We have to not only listen to vested interests in the private sector, but get dynamic markets operating and bring in more and more and more people so that our economy can grow much faster and be much more inclusive and be more labor intensive. That's the direction we have to go in. If we have